Nick Van der Rijn had been hunting ghosts his entire adult life. He'd never found one, not even close. In fact, he wasn't seriously thinking about finding ghosts that night as he waited for the others to assemble. Expect too much, and you make mistakes. Nick tried never to expect too much. He checked his watch. 10:23. In 7 minutes, the students would officially be late, but Nick doubted anyone would actually arrive past the deadline. An invitation to a ghost hunt was something all of his students wanted. Tonight, 5 students were coming, the entire senior practicum class. Nick wore his usual ghost hunting outfit, which included sturdy hiking boots, jeans, and a navy windbreaker to which he'd attached reflective stickers. He didn't usually find himself near roads on hunts, but it always paid to be careful. Nick unzipped his jacket, annoyed by the unseasonably cool weather this September evening, and wondered if he should get in the van. He'd always been sensitive to the cold, hated it really. On the other hand, the humid St. Louis summers suited him just fine. He was always just getting comfortable when everyone else was whining to building maintenance to lower the air conditioning setting. First to arrive was Ken Kostermeyer. No surprise there. Ken was the most fervent student Nick had ever had. He sat in on classes he wasn't signed up for, took tests he'd comped out of, and wrote papers on various paranormal subjects just because they interested him. He was also meticulous in the field, so Nick trusted him with their equipment, though most of the items, like the voice-activated recorders, were fairly idiot-proof. Ken walked up to Nick and nodded. He glanced in the beat-up white cargo van Nick always used for these expeditions. "Everything's there," Nick said. Ken nodded. "Yep." He climbed into the van and began checking the recorders and cameras for low batteries. Nick smiled. Ken was always thorough, double-checking and triple-checking everything, every time. Valerie Jensen was right behind Ken. She was a mystery to Nick. From the first, she had come around to his office at odd times, wearing low-cut blouses and short skirts. At first, he thought that was just how she dressed, but then he noticed that on days she wasn't in his class, she had a tendency to go for jeans and t-shirts. Nick wasn't immune to her charms. She was a pretty blonde who obviously knew how to use makeup and scent to her advantage, but no student was good-looking enough to risk a career for. What really puzzled him was why she'd picked him out of all of her professors to focus on. Was it his age? Was it the fact that he was already engaged and therefore technically unavailable? Or maybe she'd done a little research and realized which Van der Rijn's Nick was related to. The smell of money could be a tempting lure, especially for someone like Valerie. She'd mentioned her humble beginnings a few times more than necessary, perhaps to elicit some sympathy from him. The old phrase had been marrying up. Nick wondered if that were her plan. Valerie had arrived with her friend, Sarah Polensky, which relieved Nick. Ken was too single-minded to talk much on the hunts, and Nick didn't feel comfortable being the sole focus of Valerie's attention. Sarah was a good buffer. That just left Craig and Mike. Nick checked his watch. 4 minutes. Everyone knew he didn't wait for slackers, so neither Craig nor Mike would be surprised to miss out if they were even 1 minute late. But they weren't. Nick knew they wouldn't be. Though Mike was not nearly as interested in parapsychology as the rest, and Craig had a dozen different clubs and fraternity responsibilities, they still couldn't pass up a ghost hunt. Both came walking up from the direction of their fraternity house 3 blocks away. "Just made it," said Nick. "Come on, let's go." Craig Nelson grinned his crooked grin and hopped inside to sit beside Ken and watch him test their ancient equipment. Craig was good at watching others work, but he usually had to be asked to contribute his own efforts when it was needed. Nick settled into the driver's seat of the van and started it up. The van coughed to life. Nick dreaded the day he would have to replace it, but at least it was going to serve one more night. The college could rarely find the money for even a replacement voice recorder or digital camera, let alone a van. Mike Ashburton wasn't as fascinated with the equipment as the others. He rode shotgun and grinned widely as the van shuddered into gear. "We're off to see the wizard," he said, which was what Mike always said when Nick started the van. At least he didn't finish the line, but Nick was tired of the predictability. Nick smiled to himself at the irony. Here he was, a ghost hunting professor whose classes were always full, who got to do exactly what he wanted with his life. And he was tired of the predictability. Not just Mike's tired joke, but of everything. His apartment, his love life, his job, even the ghost hunts. Although some part of his soul still got excited each time he went out, he had, nearly 20 years after his first hunt, become jaded. Though truly, Nick was just a little excited about tonight's hunt. While driving around the hills of southwest St. Louis County near Eureka, he'd noticed a huge house complete with turrets and gables tucked away in the back of a valley. He hadn't noticed it before because the highway department had just this summer cut down the trees, bushes, and briars along the road. Now the house could be seen, peeking between the stately catalpa and oaks that surrounded it. Even more exciting than the house was the small cemetery on the slope of the hill below the house. Nick had never heard of a cemetery in that area, so he checked into it. It was a family burial ground, listed as Ravenscroft Cemetery in the county records, and had been in existence for over 100 years. The current owner was Pandora Whalley, 24 years old, and the other resident of the house was her uncle, Reginald Whalley. It was Mr. Whalley who had told Nick it would be all right to drive up the road marked private and stay for an hour in the cemetery tonight. The trip didn't take long, and Nick caught the edge of excitement coming from the students. Several of them had come with him before, but not to a place that hadn't been investigated. The previous hunts had happened in local stores, libraries, and houses where ghost hunts had been held many times. The students had enjoyed them but hadn't really expected to accumulate any new data. This was different. Tonight they'd be the first. Ken was probably already dreaming of writing the hunt up and publishing it on his website. Nick turned the van down the narrow private gravel drive and negotiated it slowly. Branches full of wild grape and trumpet flower vines drooped down over the road, scratching along the sides and roof of the van. The moon was almost new, so it was very little help tonight. Sarah laughed nervously from the back as the branches continued to scratch the van. It's like they're trying to find a way in. No one else laughed, but then Sarah was probably the only one who was really nervous. The others were excited. Sarah had told Nick that when she was small, a ghost had pulled her hair and tried to trip her as she went down the stairs at her grandmother's house. So while she wanted to know more and to investigate, she tended to be the most timid of the group. Nick avoided the turn to the right and continued on straight, even though that way was nearly overgrown with weeds. But Reginald Whalley had clearly stated that the main drive went to the house. It was the overgrown stretch that led to the cemetery. "We don't mow it often," he said with a chuckle. "Usually only when there's a funeral." The weeds in the drive and the overhanging tree branches made the headlights appear to be illuminating a dark tunnel. Nick concentrated hard on making sure he didn't accidentally go off the road, trusting Mike to tell him when to stop. A couple of 100 yards later, Mike said, "This is it." Nick stopped the van. To the right of the van, nearly obliterated by honeysuckle, was a low wrought iron fence adorned with twisted finials. Nick could just make it out now that he knew it was there. "I see a gate just behind us," said Mike. "We almost missed it." "Good thing your eyes are sharp," said Nick. He turned off the engine. Ken flicked on a flashlight and handed it up to Nick. "Okay, everyone, get the equipment and let's get set up. Craig, why don't you see if the gate's locked?" No one objected. They were used to Ken ordering them about. He had an unconscious knack for taking the lead. Nick had always been fascinated that some people were so capable at assuming responsibility, while others couldn't project authority no matter how hard they tried. It didn't take long for the students to pile out of the van with the cameras and recorders. Craig had already opened the gate by the time the rest of them had arrived. The cemetery wasn't as overgrown as the road. Perhaps someone mowed here once in a while. White limestone markers stuck out of the grass at odd angles, glowing in the light from his flashlight. The night was absolutely still and soundless, and that was odd. Usually Missouri summer nights were full of frogs, crickets, and katydids. Nick could hear some in the distance, but the sound was muted. This place felt like it were somehow separated from the rest of the world, as if the gate to the cemetery opened into a different world than the normal one in which Nick normally lived. Ken whistled as he shone his flashlight toward the instrument in his hands. These are amazing EMF readings. They are off the scale. Never seen anything like it. Looks like a great place to get data. Could be an underground cable for all you know, said Craig. Don't get too excited. Maybe, said Nick. We can check with the utility company later. Just keep track of the readings and we'll figure out what it all means in the lab. Nick raised his flashlight and shone it into the cemetery. The white stones reflected back the light, almost blinding in its intensity. A taller stone that was still vertical, probably newer, was in the far corner. Something moved near it. Nick swung the light that way. Someone stood there. Nick's heart about leapt out of his chest in the moment it took between seeing the figure and realizing she was a living woman. A woman in jeans and a loose green cardigan, with auburn hair spilling down her shoulders. Green eyes stared back at Nick with reproach. Nick couldn't look away. "What the hell?" yelled Mike. "What are you doing here?" "This is private property," said the woman. "Please leave now." "We've got permission to be here," said Mike. "What the hell are you doing out here?" A quiet, "Shut up, Mike," from Ken silenced any more objections from Mike. Ken gave Nick a sideways glance, deferring to Nick's authority. The woman pointed in the direction of the house. "I live here at Ravenscroft. What are you doing here?" "I'm Dr. Nick Vanderrine," said Nick, finding his voice once more. So this was Pandora Whalley, the true owner of the estate. Briefly, he pointed his light at his own face. "I'm a professor of parapsychology at Lafayette College in Jefferson County. These are some of my students. I called Reginald Whalley a few days ago and asked if we could come by and take some readings. He said we could and gave us directions to the cemetery." "Well, he didn't say anything to me." "I'm sorry," said Nick. "Perhaps we should go then?" The woman hesitated, then shrugged. "Oh, stay. I doubt they'll mind." "They?" asked Valerie. "Them," said the woman. She gestured towards the markers. "So what? Do they talk to you?" asked Sarah. Her voice quavered and she looked, even in the darkness, even paler than usual. Nick wondered if she would bolt back down the lane, ticks, chiggers, and poison ivy notwithstanding. The woman laughed. "No, silly, they're dead. But that doesn't mean they don't mark the occasional disturbance of their rest. Breaks the tedium, I think. I come here a lot. It's a peaceful place." "Yeah, right," said Sarah under her breath. Nick didn't want the situation to get any more out of hand, and he had felt himself drawn to the strange woman by the grave marker. She was so calm, which Nick was sure he wouldn't be if strangers suddenly invaded his late-night solitude. And she had something else, something that sparked Nick's curiosity. A mystery lurked in her eyes. Everyone continued monitoring the site. He walked towards the woman. "You must be Pandora Whalley. I'm sorry about the mix-up." He held out his hand. A frigid breeze swept by him briefly, making him shiver. But then it was gone. For the first time at a ghost hunt, Nick truly felt like he was being watched. But that was ridiculous. It was just that the cemetery was remote and slightly creepy, and the presence of Miss Whalley had surprised them all. Nick knew it was his imagination, but he couldn't help it. Even jaded ghost hunters could still be spooked. It didn't happen very often to Nick, and it usually annoyed him when it did. But tonight, he was intrigued. The woman shook his hand. Her skin was as cool as if she'd been out here a while. "Yes, I'm Pandora. I went to LC a few years ago. I don't remember seeing you, but then I majored in English literature." "Then you had the inestimable Viceroy Ferris for freshman comp," said Nick. "Oh yes," said Pandora with a quirky lopsided grin that didn't match the tension around her eyes. "And for other classes as well. I didn't mind him so much. He was a windbag, but harmless. It was Dr. Martin that I found a little daunting." "I only know her socially, from faculty parties," said Nick. but I agree, she has a certain way of looking down her nose that can be intimidating, even if you're also faculty. She couldn't abide a split infinitive, but if it was good enough for Shakespeare, it should be good enough for Dr. Martin, I should think. Victorian grammarians were so uptight. Nick wasn't entirely sure what Pandora meant by that. He hadn't majored in English. He decided to switch the subject. Look, I'd like to apologize again for us bursting in on you. I thought your uncle would have let you know. It's all right, she said. I was bored anyway. That's usually when I come out here. At night, without a flashlight. Anytime, and I know the path. It doesn't change. I come here when I can't sleep, and I weed a bit, scrape moss off the stones. They're my ancestors, after all. A little respect for their last resting place is in order. That one, she pointed to a tiny stone near Sarah, is where my great-great-grandmother, Catherine Marsters, lies. And her? Pandora pointed at a stone carved into the shape of an angel weeping over an empty chair. That's Jane Ravenscroft, Catherine's grandmother. She came here in 1838, just after her husband Edmund died. Uprooted herself, her daughter, and their belongings, and moved them to St. Louis from England. I can't imagine doing that myself. Leaving everything behind like that? Sounds like you should have majored in history. This house is history enough, and the cemetery. You can't go anywhere in the house or on the grounds that isn't weighed down with the years. It's a little wearying sometimes. But you come out here often anyway? I said wearying, not trying, said Pandora. I love this land. I love taking care of the cemetery. Her voice held a fervent note that held Nick's attention. She did love it here, weight of years and all. I love cemeteries too, said Nick. Always have. They seem serene, quiet. They are sometimes. Ouch. Well, he and his team had barged in on her, so Nick knew they deserved the remark, although it seemed a bit hostile for the friendly way she'd been talking with Nick up to now. Suddenly he wondered if Pandora really meant him and his students at all. But if not them, then what could she possibly mean? Nick turned to look at his students. Valerie and Sarah were already back at the van, Mike hovered near the gate. Ken and Craig had their cameras and recorders out and looked primed to stay the night. But if they found more unusual readings and they wanted to be allowed back, they had to make sure they didn't anger Pandora Whalley. It was time to go. They could return her solitude to her. Let's pack it up, he said. Already? Asked Ken. Yes, already. Nick looked back at Pandora. She had a small smile on her face, as if she appreciated his gesture. We'll be going now, he said. I hope we haven't disturbed you too much. If we'd like to come back, can I call you to get your permission? Come back whenever you'd like, she said. It'll be interesting to see if you find anything. Will you let me know? Of course, said Nick. He took a step back. Pandora's smile faltered and she reached out to grab his arm. No, she said. Not on that grave. Nick looked around and saw a low, flat stone nearly covered in leaves. Whatever had been inscribed on it had been obliterated by the elements long ago. That was the problem with limestone markers. Given enough time, they melted away and were as fragile and mortal as the remains they guarded. Sorry, he said. Where Pandora's fingers had touched him, his skin felt on fire. I'll call you and let you know what we find. He felt a strange desire to continue the conversation, to learn more about this woman who visited cemeteries in the dead of night and knew the details of the lives of those buried within its boundaries. I hope you do, she said. To Nick, she did sound hopeful, as if she suspected he and his team would find something, and she wanted to know exactly what it was. Perhaps she had heard or felt odd things here at night on occasion. When that happened, most people wanted some corroboration so they could reassure themselves they weren't going crazy. But Pandora seemed too self-contained and calm to be worried about insanity. There was some other reason she wanted to know. Nick didn't really care. He wanted to talk to her again, At the very least, to get more information on the grounds and the cemetery. He'd need it, his background, for his research. Nick turned away from Pandora reluctantly and made his way back to the van. The others were already inside and were silent. Nick turned the van around carefully and drove back down the lane. He stared into the cemetery as long as he could, but Pandora was gone.